Elena Lark signed nothing that morning, because there was nothing left in the house worth her signature, and she stood instead in the doorway of her father's study and watched him sign her life away in a hand that shook only on the final letter of his name. The room smelled of tallow and old paper, and the particular sourness of a fire built too small to warm anything but the desk it was meant to serve. Outside, the third rainless week of August lay over Feniston like a hand pressed flat to a mouth, and the well in the yard had dropped so low that the bucket came up half mud. Her father did not look at her when the solicitor's clerk took the paper away to be sealed. He looked instead at his own hands, spread flat on the blotter, as though they belonged to a stranger who had wronged him. In her pocket, worn smooth by 11 years of thumbing, sat a small wooden wren, no bigger than a thumb, carved from a scrap of ash and marked on its underside with 2 letters that were not her own. She had never once, in all that time, been able to say why she kept it, only that her mother had carved its twin the same autumn she died, and had given the twin away to somebody Elena had been too young to remember, and had told her, before the fever took the last of her breath, that a debt is only a promise that has forgotten how to be kind. Elena had not understood it then. She understood it a great deal better now, watching her father seal his daughter into a marriage contract with the ugliest duke in the kingdom, in order to keep the roof over both their heads. The Duke of Ashcombe was said, in the kindest tellings, to be a difficult man to look at, and in the unkind ones, a man the fire itself had refused to finish. Nan Sorrel, who had nursed Elena from the cradle and outlived 2 husbands and most of her patients, found her in the hall afterward, pulling on her travelling gloves with the grim economy of a woman girding for battle rather than a wedding. "You could still run," Nan said, not because she meant it, but because someone had to say it aloud so it could be refused. Elena did not look up from her gloves. "Run where, Nan?" "Into the drought." Nan snorted, not quite a laugh. "There's always the drought," she said. "It's the one thing that never turns you away at the door." There was a silence between them that was not unkind, and into it Elena closed her hand around the wren in her pocket, and felt, for the first time that day, something other than dread. She did not know yet that the man she was riding toward had carried its twin in his own pocket for 11 years, past every door in the kingdom that might have told him what it meant. She only knew that the carriage was coming at noon, and that by evening she would belong, on paper, to a stranger the whole country called a beast, and that her father had not once, in the signing of it, been able to meet her eyes. That, she thought, watching the dust rise on the road before the horses had even come into view, was the truest part of the whole transaction. Everyone in it had found some way not to look at what they were doing. The carriage that came for her was black lacquer under a season's dust, and the crest upon its door was worn nearly smooth, a hawk and a ring of thorn, and the coachman who handed her up did not meet her eyes either, which she was beginning to understand was simply how the world conducted its business with women in her position. Nan rode with her, because no one had thought to forbid it, and for 3 hours they said almost nothing, the drought-yellow fields sliding past the window like a page turned too slowly to read. Ashcombe rose out of the haze at the end of the second hour, grey stone against a sky gone white with heat, and the gatehouse arch that swallowed the carriage smelled of cold mortar and something older beneath it. Riverstone, tallow smoke, the ghost of centuries of suppers. Elena pressed her palm flat to the carriage window, as though she might hold the whole moving world still behind it a moment longer before it became her life. It did not stop moving. It never once, in all the months that followed, agreed to stop moving for her convenience, and she came in time to be glad of that, though on the first evening she was only afraid. The wedding itself was arranged with the haste of a debt called due, which was, in every particular that mattered, exactly what it was. And Elena stood in the small stone chapel at Ashcombe, in a gown that had been her mother's, taken in at the waist by Nan's swift needle the night before, and watched the Duke of Ashcombe come down the aisle toward her, like a man walking to a verdict rather than a marriage. The scars ran from his left temple, down through the jaw and into the collar of his coat. Old burn scars, silvered with years, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent and unfair suggestion of a sneer that she would learn, within the week, had nothing whatsoever to do with what he felt. His eyes, when they finally reached hers, were a plain and steady brown, and they held there a moment longer than courtesy required, as though he were checking her face against some other face he carried folded away somewhere private. Lord Josiah Reeve stood at the Duke's right hand as witness and man of business both, a lean, handsome, silver-templed man whose smile arrived half a second before it reached his eyes and left half a second after, and who bowed to Elena with a warmth so exact it might have been measured with a rule. "A pleasure, Miss Lark," he said. "Your family's difficulties are so very nearly resolved." He said difficulties the way another man might say debts, and Elena filed the softness of the word away without yet knowing why it troubled her. The vows were short. The Duke's voice, when it came, was low and even and entirely without theatre, a voice built for rooms far larger than the one it was used in, and when he took her hand to set the ring there, she felt, beneath the calluses of a man who rode and worked and did not spend his days behind a desk, a peculiar tremor at the base of his thumb, quickly stilled, as though he had caught himself doing something he did not wish observed. She did not understand it. She only noted it, the way she noted everything now, because noting things was the one power left to a woman with no other power at all. That night, in the private hour granted a new married pair by a household too well trained to intrude upon it, the Duke of Ashcombe did not come to her bed. He came instead to the small sitting room adjoining it, where she sat rigid in a borrowed chair, with her hands folded in her lap, like a woman awaiting sentence. And he set upon the table between them a small, carved wooden bird. It was a wren. It was ashwood, worn dark with handling, and it was, in every line and every small imperfection of the beak, the exact twin of the one folded still in her own closed fist. Elena looked at it a long moment before she trusted her voice. "Where did you get this?" she said. He did not sit. He stood at the window, with his back half to her, which she would learn was his particular cowardice, the only one he owned to, and he said, "I have carried it 11 years, and I have never once known the name of the woman who gave it to me, only that she smelled of wood smoke and rosemary, and that she set my burned hand in cold water for 3 days running, and did not once flinch from the sight of it, though I was 7 years old and half out of my mind with the pain of it, and thought I would surely die under her roof rather than my own." Elena's hand had gone very still around the wren in her pocket. "My mother kept bees," she said slowly, "and rosemary along the south wall." The Duke turned from the window then, and for the first time she saw something move behind the ruin of his face that was not composure. "I did not choose you for your name," he said, "nor for your father's debt, though I let the world believe that, because the truth was mine to keep or spend as I judged wise. And I judged it wise, until tonight, to keep it. I chose you because when I learned the name Lark was attached to the ring of that debt, I understood that the woman who saved my life, and the fire that scarred it, and the family who kept me hidden through the worst month of my childhood, had none of them ever been paid, in 11 years, so much as a word of thanks." Elena sat very still. "And so you married me," she said, "instead of thanking me." He almost smiled, and the almost cost him something visible. "It seemed to me," he said, "the larger gesture." She did not sleep that night, not from fear now, but from the particular restlessness of a mind rearranging every room in itself to make space for a single unlooked-for fact. And by morning she had questions enough to fill a year. Ashcombe by daylight was a colder education than the chapel had allowed. She learned its corridors from Nan, who learned them faster than she did, gossiping her way into the confidence of the housekeeper within 3 days flat. She learned that the fire that had scarred the young Duke, then merely the second son of a second son, had never been fully explained to the household, only spoken of in the hush reserved for things a family agrees, without ever voting on it, not to discuss. She learned that Lord Reeve had managed the Ashcombe estates for 11 years, since the old Duke's death, with a competence so total that no one below him had thought to question it, and that he called Cassian cousin with an ease that suggested blood closer than the Duke's own steward should rightly claim. And she learned, within the first fortnight, that she had a rival she had not been told to expect. Lord Aubrey Finch came to Ashcombe on the pretext of congratulating the match, a fair, easy, good-humoured young courtier who had, Nan informed her with the relish of a woman delivering the best gossip of the season, asked for Elena's hand himself, quite properly, quite honestly, 3 months before the Lark debt had ever surfaced, and been refused by her father for want of a dowry to match. He bowed over her hand in the long gallery with a warmth that had nothing calculated in it at all, and said, low enough that only she could hear it, "I hope he is kind to you, Miss Lark, because I confess I hoped to be the one given that particular task." There was no bitterness in it. That was the strange grace of Aubrey Finch, that he could say a true and painful thing and leave no wound behind it. And Elena found herself liking him at once, which frightened her a little, because liking him changed nothing at all about where her hand now wore a ring. Reeve observed the exchange from across the gallery with his exact ruled smile, and later that evening, over supper, he raised his glass to the match with a toast so smoothly worded that only afterward did Elena understand it had contained, folded inside its courtesies, a small public accounting of every shilling her father owed, and the precise date by which the estate expected to see itself made whole. The Duke's jaw had tightened through the whole of it, and under the table, where only she could have seen it, his thumb moved once, hard, across the second knuckle of his left hand, the worst burned one, a gesture she was coming to recognize as the only tell a man so schooled in stillness allowed himself. That night she asked him plainly why he permitted Reeve such license in his own hall. "Because for 11 years, the Duke said, he has kept this estate from ruin, while I learned to be a man other men would follow, rather than a boy they pitied. And a debt like that is not so easily called due. Elena turned the wren over in her fingers, feeling for a mark she had not thought to look for until that moment. And what is owed to you, she said, is apparently never called due at all. He looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight and did not answer, and she understood that she had struck closer to a wound than either of them had yet named aloud, and let it lie, for now, unopened between them, the way a woman learns to let a door stand ajar, rather than force it before its hinges are ready. The obstacle, once it showed its whole shape, showed it in public, which he would come to understand was Reeve's particular gift, to make private cruelty look like ordinary business conducted in daylight before witnesses who could later swear they had seen nothing wrong in it. It came at the autumn accounting, held each year in the long hall before the assembled tenantry, where the estate's harvest and debts were read aloud together, so that no one man's fortune could be hidden inside another's ruin. Elena sat beside her husband for the first time in that hall as its duchess, and watched Reeve stand with his ledgers and read, in that same warm, exact voice, a list of arrears that included, near its foot, the name of Edmund Lark, her own father, still owing a further sum she had not known existed, a sum that had, Reeve explained with regret so smooth it barely disturbed the surface of his face, come due upon a second bond her father had signed some 20 years before and forgotten to settle. The hall murmured. Elena felt the blood leave her face and did not let it show in her hands, which she had learned, in 18 years of practicing composure as her only inheritance, to keep folded and quiet no matter what burned beneath them. 20 years, she said afterward, alone with Reeve in the estate office, her voice even though her pulse was not. My father has never once mentioned a second bond in 20 years of mentioning nothing else. Reeve set down his pen with the unhurried care of a man who has all the time in the world and intends her to notice it. Debts have long memories, Your Grace, he said, and it is only my duty to see the estate is not made poorer by another man's forgetting. She asked to see the bond itself. He regretted, with real seeming sorrow, that the original had been lost some years past in a flood of the lower archive, though the copy in his own hand was, he assured her, entirely faithful to it. Elena did not believe him, and for the first time understood that not believing a man was not the same as being able to prove him wrong, and that the gap between those two things was exactly where a man like Reeve chose to build his house. That night the Duke found her in the gallery, still awake, the wren turned over and over between her fingers, and she told him what she suspected without softening it. He listened the whole way through without once interrupting, which she was learning was his particular courtesy, and when she finished he said only, "My father trusted him absolutely," in a voice that told her the trusting had cost him something he had never allowed himself to examine. "And you," she said, "do you trust him?" There was a long silence, long enough that the candle guttered once and steadied. "I have needed to trust him," he said finally, "because I did not know how else the estate would have survived what the fire cost it. And a man learns to need what has kept him standing, whether or not it deserves the debt." It was the first time she heard, in his voice, something close to the fear a scarred boy might have carried into manhood without ever setting it down, and she reached across the space between their chairs, not quite touching his hand, and said, "Then let us find out together whether it deserves it."
He looked at her hand a long moment before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost too plain to bear. "I would like that very much," he said, "more than I have wanted anything in 11 years.
And then, because the hour and the honesty both had gone further than either of them had prepared for, a servant's knock came at the door, with word that Lord Reeve requested the Duke's presence below, and the moment folded itself away unfinished, the way the truest moments in that house always seem to, interrupted a half-breath before they could be spoken whole. It was Nan, in the end, who found the thread that pulled the rest of it loose, because Nan had long since made a study of servants' halls, and knew that the lower archive Reeve claimed had flooded had in fact never once taken water in living memory, the old groundskeeper having told her so over cider, without the least notion of what he was handing away. Elena went down into that archive herself 2 nights later, with a single candle and Aubrey Finch, of all unlikely companions, standing watch at the stair, because he had overheard enough of the household's whispering to guess where the real danger lay, and had offered his help, with no condition attached to it at all, beyond wishing her well. "It is not for her sake alone I do this," he told her quietly on the stair, though he did not say for whose, and she did not ask, understanding that some kindnesses are better left ungratified with explanation. The archive smelled of dust and tallow and the particular mineral coldness of stone that has never seen the sun, and it took the better part of an hour of careful searching before her fingers found, wedged behind a false board at the back of the 3rd shelf, a ledger far older than any Reeve had ever shown the accounting hall, its spine cracked, its pages the color of weak tea. She opened it by candlelight and found, in a hand she did not recognize, an entry 21 years old, for the keep of a boy, unnamed, Autumn, paid to E. Lark, and beneath it, in the same hand, a second entry, smaller, guiltier somehow even in ink, for the silence of the same household regarding the fire at Ashcombe, that same autumn. Elena sat down hard on the cold floor with the ledger in her lap and read it twice more, to be sure her eyes had not simply built the sentence she wanted to see. The fire that scarred her husband had not been an accident of a hearth left untended, as the household legend had it. It had been set. And the household paid to keep silent about who had set it was her own family, 21 years gone, her mother and her father both, hiding a burned boy, and burying, along with his wounds, whatever they had known of the hand that lit the blaze. She found Reeve's own hand further down the same page, a later entry, more recent, adjusting a sum, covering a difference, the ink not yet fully faded, and understood in one cold drop of the stomach that the debt called in against her father this autumn was not old forgetfulness at all. It was Reeve closing a book he had opened himself 21 years before, the moment he judged the last living witnesses too poor and too powerless to be believed against him. She was still sitting there, the candle guttering low, when the door above opened and feet came down the stair too quickly to be Aubrey's careful tread, and she looked up to find Reeve himself in the doorway, unhurried even now, his smile arriving exactly half a second before his eyes. "You have found my little archive," he said. "I confess I always thought someone eventually would." Elena rose slowly, the ledger held against her chest like a shield. "You set the fire," she said. "Not I," he said gently, as though correcting a child's small error of grammar. "My father did.
I merely inherited the difficulty of managing what it left unfinished. And he did not so much as raise his voice as he said it, which frightened her far more than shouting would have, because a man who could speak of a burned child with that particular calm had long ago made peace with whatever it cost other people to keep him comfortable.
The worst of it, Reeve explained, standing quite still in the archive doorway, with the candle throwing his shadow long up the stone wall behind him, was not the fire itself, which, after all, the boy had survived, but the inheritance it had been meant to settle. My father was the elder son's true heir by every law of blood and reason, he said, and was cheated of the title by a marriage contract signed in haste and never properly witnessed. And so he did what men have always done when the law will not give them what is theirs. He arranged for the law to have less to protect. Elena felt the cold of the floor come up through her shoes. "You tried to kill a child," she said, "so that your father might have a title." "I tried nothing," Reeve said, his voice still even, still warm, still wearing its courtesy like a coat that had never once been asked to keep out real weather. "I was 11 years old myself that autumn, and knew nothing of it until much later, when the keeping of the secret had already become the family trade, more profitable by far than the title would ever have been, since a secret well kept can be milked forever, and a title, once won, must simply be defended. It was, in its own terrible way, an honest answer, and Elena understood, with the particular vertigo of discovering an enemy who is not simply evil, but reasonable, that he believed every word of his own arithmetic. "I did not choose to be born into it," he said, more quietly now, "any more than your husband chose to be burned in it. And I have managed this estate for 11 years with a competence he could not have matched himself, whatever the ledgers underneath the ledgers might also say. And if that is a sin, it is one this whole house has been glad enough to eat the fruit of." He took a step nearer, and for the first time something in his composure thinned. Not fear exactly, but the recognition of a man watching a door he had kept locked for 2 decades finally give at the hinge. "Give me the book, Miss Lark," he said, "and none of this need go further than this room. Your father's debt forgiven twice over, and your husband spared a truth that will only reopen a wound he has spent 11 years learning to live beside." She thought, in that moment, of her father's shaking hand upon the marriage contract, of the Duke's thumb moving once across his ruined knuckle beneath a supper table, of her mother's voice telling her, years before she understood it, that a debt is only a promise that has forgotten how to be kind. And she thought that the kindest thing left to her, the only kindness that would still be a kindness in a year's time, and not merely a mercy that curdled into complicity, was to refuse him. "No," she said. It was a single word, and she let the silence after it do the explaining, the way her mother had once let silence explain the things a body could not yet afford to say aloud. And when she did speak again, her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "You have spent 21 years choosing which truths this family could afford to hear," she said, "and I find I am done paying that particular bill on your terms." Reeve's hand moved, quick and involuntary, toward the ledger in her arms, a single ungoverned lunge that told her, more surely than any confession could have, exactly how much the book was worth to him. And it was that same lunge, and no cleverness of hers at all, that put the truth of him beyond any further denying. Because Aubrey Finch had come down the stair in time to see it. And a man's hand does not reach for an old book that way, unless the book can hang him.
The morning after brought the first rain in 6 weeks, a hard, grey, unglamorous downpour that filled the dry well in a single night and left the fields of Feniston and the fields of Ashcombe alike steaming faintly at dawn. And into that changed weather the Dowager Duchess, Isolde Vane, the old Duke's mother, who had watched the whole affair from her private rooms with the patient suspicion of a woman who had buried one husband and outlived 2 scandals, sent word that the household would gather that evening in the long hall, all of it, tenants included, to hear an accounting read aloud, so that no one afterward could claim to have heard a different version of it than his neighbor. Elena had expected, given all she now knew, to feel triumphant walking into that hall. She felt instead a kind of grief she had not budgeted for, because Reeve, whatever else he was, had run this estate honestly enough, in every particular that did not touch his own guilt, and dismantling him meant unpicking 11 years of competent stitching along with the rot beneath it. The Dowager Duchess stood at the head of the hall in black bombazine gone slightly green with age, and she read the ledger herself, in a voice that set each word down whole and separate, refusing every temptation to hurry past the worst of it. And when she reached the entry for the fire, she stopped and looked directly at her grandson and said, in front of the whole assembled hall, "I believed for 20 years that accident had done this to you, because it was easier to believe than to ask questions of the man who had made himself indispensable to us. And I was wrong. And I am too old now to be ashamed of saying so plainly." It cost her visibly to say it, the plainness of age spending itself like a coin she had been saving, and the hall went very still to hear it. Reeve, given the floor to answer, did not deny a word of what had been read. He stood instead with the particular dignity of a man who has already lost and knows it, and said only that he had done what he believed necessary to protect what little his father had left him, and that he did not ask forgiveness, only that the estate's books, apart from this one old wound, be judged on their own considerable merits. He looked once at Elena and inclined his head, a small, exact, almost respectful gesture, and said, "You were cleverer than I allowed for, Your Grace, and I find I do not resent it as much as I expected to." Then he asked leave to withdraw from the estate's service, and from the country both, which the Dowager Duchess granted him without cruelty, and without mercy either, simply as a fact to be arranged, and he left the hall on his own feet, unhurried, his coat still perfectly set, and no one in that room, watching him go, felt the satisfaction they had, perhaps, expected to feel, only the flat, unglamorous relief of a wound finally named instead of merely borne. Aubrey Finch, who had stood the whole evening near the door with the ledger's true copy safe in his own keeping against exactly this eventuality, caught Elena's eye across the emptying hall and gave her the smallest of bows, a private acknowledgment between the two people who had gone down into that cold archive together, and said nothing at all, which was, from him, its own kind of grace.
It was Cassian who found her afterward, alone in the gallery, where he had first learned to say the truest things he owned. And this time, it was he who reached for her hand,
and did not stop himself part way. I have spent 11 years believing my scars were simply the world's carelessness, he said, and I find it a harder thing to carry, knowing they were somebody's design, than I ever found the burns themselves. Elena did not offer him comfort that smoothed the edge off it, because she had learned enough of this house to know that comfort offered too quickly was only another kind of lie. Then carry it honestly, she said, the way you have asked everyone around you to carry everything else. He was quiet a long moment, and then, very low, he told her that he had considered, more than once in the last week, sending her back to Feniston, back to her father, back to whatever life she might have built without a scarred stranger's debts folded into hers, because he had thought it the kinder thing, to let her go before the cost of staying grew any higher. I very nearly did it without telling you why, he admitted, and only did not because I could not, in the end, make myself believe it was kindness rather than cowardice wearing kindness's coat. She felt the old flare of anger at that, quick and clean. You would have let me believe I was unwanted, she said, rather than tell me I was only unwelcome to the danger of loving you. He flinched at unwanted, visibly, the scarred side of his mouth pulling tighter, and said, I would rather you were angry at the truth of it than grateful for a lie. And that, at least, was honestly said, and she found she could forgive the near mistake for the sake of the honesty that finally undid it. That night, for the first time since the wedding, she did not lie awake, turning the wren over in her fingers to keep her hands from shaking. She set it instead on the table beside its twin, the two small worn birds facing one another in the candlelight, and told him plainly what she would and would not accept going forward, because she had learned from her own mother that the happiest endings are the ones a person has named the terms of aloud, rather than simply been handed. I will not be managed the way Reeve managed this estate, she said, for anyone's protection, however lovingly meant. I will be told the truth, even the truth that costs you, before I am spared it. And I will keep this wren on whatever table we share for the rest of both our lives, because it is the only inheritance either of us was ever given honestly. Cassian looked at her for a long moment in the candlelight, and something in his face that had held itself locked for 11 years, finally, visibly, let go. Then those are terms I can keep, he said, and reached for her hand, and did not once, this time, let his thumb move alone across the old scar, as though the feeling in it were a secret, still to be guarded from her. They married again, properly, the following spring, in the same small stone chapel, before a congregation that this time included her father, upright and unashamed, and Aubrey Finch, who stood as groomsman and toasted the match with a joke so dry and so exactly timed that even the Dowager Duchess laughed aloud, a sound the household swore afterward they had not heard from her in a decade. A year on from the day the drought had broken, the fields around Ashcombe stood gold and heavy with a harvest good enough to forgive the memory of that rainless August entirely. And on an ordinary evening in that turned and generous autumn, Elena Lark, who was Duchess of Ashcombe now in every sense that mattered, and not merely on a signed and sealed paper, stood once more in a doorway, this time the doorway of her own sitting room, and watched her husband cross the gatehouse yard toward her,
with the unhurried gait of a man walking home rather than to a verdict. On the sill beside her sat the two small wrens, no longer facing each other in wary symmetry, but set wing to wing, and beside them a third, newly carved, smaller than either, its beak not quite even yet, because Cassian had taken up the knife himself that winter and was still learning the trade her mother had once known by heart. He came in out of the early dark, smelling of horse and cold air and wood smoke from the gatehouse fire, and pressed his scarred hand, without hesitation now, flat against the small of her back, and said, "Your father says the harvest at Feniston will clear the last of it by Michaelmas, the whole of it, paid and done." Elena leaned back into the warmth of him and did not look away from the three small birds on the sill. "Then it will be the first debt this family has ever seen the far side of, honestly," she said, and felt him laugh, quietly, against her shoulder, a sound the fire had never quite managed to take from him, after all. "And that is where we will leave them, in a house with the truth finally let all the way into every one of its rooms, the kettle still warm on the gatehouse hearth, and another good year settling in outside the door. If this one kept you close to the fire a little longer tonight, stay a moment more before you go, because it was Elena's small, stubborn no in that cold archive that stayed with me longest, and I'd love to hear in the comments which moment held you the same way, whether it was the wren, or the ledger, or Cassian's own quiet reckoning with what his scars had cost him. Subscribe to Channel Name if you'd like another story like this one waiting the next time you need somewhere warm to sit a while. The wick is burning low here now, so I'll bank the fire and leave the door latched for you. Sleep well, and be kind to yourselves, and I'll see you again by the next one.